few weeks ago, I was sitting with a couple of parents, and their adult child had made a lifestyle decision and announced it to the family. Kind of fill in the blanks on your own. And the parents were just struggling with the decision, just walking through it, trying to get a sense of what are we feeling? Why are we feeling this? How do we navigate this new journey? But what was really interesting is in the midst of that conversation, suddenly they just kind of turned on each other. They were looking at each other, and suddenly one of them's like, "It's because you were never home. You were an absentee dad. You worked too much." And the other one looking back, the other one going, "No, you were a helicopter parent and you coddled them and you didn't allow them to make their own decisions." And suddenly we're in this tennis match, tit for tat, back and forth, man, and they're just going at it. I made the mistake of going, "Hey, time out, can I ask something?" at that point. I said, "Let me just ask a question real quick. Is it possible your adult child made an adult decision because they're an adult?" Seems like a simple question. But man, it got really quiet for a minute, and I looked up and I realized where they'd been looking at each other. They were now fiercely both looking at me like they're cheetahs and I'm a piece of meat and I'm about to get it. You know what I mean? Like they're genuinely angry, and I could see it in their eyes. I could see what they were thinking in this case. Are you telling me Johnny made a mistake? Are you telling me little Johnny made a bad decision? No, little Johnny did not make a mistake. Johnny is a victim. He is a victim of poor parenting. Our Johnny was a victim of the wrong friends. Our poor Johnny is a victim of the culture around him. He didn't make a bad decision. This thing landed on him. Poor Johnny. Johnny was a victim. Do you know any Johnnies in your life? Know any victims in your life? Life is just sort of happening to them. And what I watched is those two parents more and more fall into what I call a victim mindset in this situation. And it was a trap. And we're still working to try to kind of climb out of that one. Do you know anybody like that struggles with a victim mentality in life? I think that's something we see often in our culture these days. Today we're going to look at a character that could have easily fallen into a victim mindset. But he didn't. And he's one of my favorite characters in the Bible, so much so I named one of my children after him. His name is Joseph. And Joseph's another one of those big characters of the Bible that we could spend several weeks talking about, but we don't have time. So I'm just going to catch us up real quick on where we are in this conversation for today. We've talked before about Abraham. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac then had a son named Jacob. Jacob's name later would be changed to Israel. He would have 12 sons. Those 12 sons would go on to be the 12 tribes of Israel. One of those sons is Joseph. He is actually the 11th of the 12 kids in the line of succession on that. And so Joseph is part of the lineage of Abraham. His father is Jacob, whose name would be changed to Israel. For whatever reasons, the father, that being Jacob, kind of doted on Joseph. He kind of treated him more special than the other brothers, gave him special attention. And the other brothers in the family noticed, and this caused a tension in the family. Anytime one kid kind of gets favoritism from another parent, this can cause an unhealthy dynamic in any family. And this was happening. For whatever reason, his dad really liked to dote on him. Even at one point, making a special coat of many colors for him. He didn't make it for the other sons, Joseph only. And Joseph would wear it around, and it would just be a constant reminder to the other brothers in the family, hey, Dad kind of just loves me a little bit more. And so as you can imagine, the tension in this family was getting worse and worse. And to add insult to injury, Joseph had a bad habit of going out and tattling on his brothers when they were away and going back to Dad and telling them all the little things they were doing wrong and should be doing better. And as you can imagine, this just made things worse and worse and worse. The tipping point, however, seemed to happen when Joseph was given a dream by God. In that dream, there were 12 stalks of wheat. One of the stalks of wheat was upright, whereas the other 11 stalks of wheat were bowing down to the one stalk of wheat. Joseph goes out and tells his brother and his families this, and they're not stupid, neither are we. They knew exactly what he was saying in this case. They're like, so what you're saying is someday we're all going to be bowing down to you, huh? And he's like, yeah, and you can imagine how that kind of landed on the whole thing. I mean, they weren't real fond of that story or that dream, and it just made things worse and worse and worse. And I think the brothers were kind of left with this conversation, like, what do you do with this obnoxious sibling we have? I mean, this person is over the top. What are we going to do with him? Well, one day they made a decision on what to do with him, and it wasn't a really good one. One day, his father sent Joseph out to go check on the brothers, and they saw him coming at a distance, and they decided, we're going to put an end to this thing. When Joseph got there, they tied him up, they threw him in a pit, and when a slave trader went by, they sold him off to the slave trader. They took his coat of many colors, and they kind of ripped it up, and they got some goat's blood, and they splattered it on the coat, and then they went back to his dad, and they said, Dad, I guess he got eaten by an animal or something. We're not real sure, but we don't know where he's at. Pretty drastic solution to the Joseph problem. And so for a minute, you're thinking, I've got a dysfunctional family. I'm guessing Joe's got your beat right now. You know what I mean? Pretty drastic solution on what they did there. And that's exactly what happened in the story. Joseph was sold off to a man named Potiphar in Egypt, who was the head of Egypt's guard. And we'll talk about that story in just a minute. Before we do that, though, I want to be clear about something. In this story, at this stage, Joseph is a victim. There are things that happen in life where we are victimized. What we're going to learn more and more, though, is there's a difference between I am a victim in some given situation and I have a victim mindset. Those are two very clear distinctions that we're going to have to work through today. But in this case, at no point did Joseph desire to be tied up, thrown into a pit, and sold off into slavery. That was not part of his life plan. I'm quite sure he didn't expect his day to quite end up like that. This day did, in fact, land on him. And there is a piece where Joseph was a victim in this story. And the same's true in our lives too. There are going to be times in your lives where things are going to happen. There are going to be bad things that happen. Jesus even told us, on this earth you will find trouble. There's almost a promise of that in Scripture. And we've talked about this before. We said life is not a promise of rainbows and unicorns, right? I mean, it's not every day is going to be the day of your dreams. There are going to be things that happen in our lives that will cause pain, that will cause hurt, that will change the direction and course of our lives. That's just a reality. But what we're going to deal with today is that question of, will we allow those things to move us into a victim mindset? Yes, we may be a victim for a season, but are we going to allow that to define us in a way that puts us on a trajectory and down roads we wish we didn't go down? And the big difference here is just the reality that victims and those with a victim mindset are struggling with grief. You say, what do you mean by grief? Grief simply being that when something happens to you in life, something changes or something is taken from you. You can physically have something taken from you, or sometimes it can be emotionally. It could be your dignity. It can be your pride. It could be your reputation. There's all sorts of things that when bad things occur in life can be taken from you. And when you lose those things, you have to walk through grief. You have to deal with the feelings, the emotions, and what's going on at the time. And it's healthy. You absolutely must walk through grief. Those 5 stages of grief are real. I've seen it time and time again, whether that's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Walking through those is important. And what's also important is to realize different people walk through those things at different speeds, and we need to be able to allow people the room to walk through their grieving so they can deal with, hey, what just happened? Why am I feeling this way? And how am I going to deal with this in the future? Those are all important questions to be asking. But an important distinction we need to make here that we got to get our arms around is this. Healthy people eventually bounce back. They bounce back. Healthy people realize, yes, I've got to walk through these stages of grief. I've got to deal with these things, but there's going to come a point when I need to wipe the dust off. I need to move on in these new realities and these new things, and I've got to get on with life. That's just a part of the process. But what happens is victims get caught in a trap of self-pity. They get caught with the cycle of self-pity. Rather than bouncing back, they never escape to victory. Instead, what they do oftentimes is they'll replay the situation over and over again in their head. And somehow that maybe gives them comfort, maybe even playing off different scenarios of, hey, if this happens again next time, here's what I'm going to say to that person. Or if this thing happens, here's what I'm going to do on this time. And they get in a cycle where they just plays over and over in their head. And then they like to tell other people this story of how they were a victim too over and over again. Why? Because they enjoy the sympathy they get from others when they're walking through it. It gives them a temporary relief of their pain. But what they don't realize is it's a trap. It's only temporary. Others can't justify that pain, but yet we're sitting there and going, yeah, but the world stole my dreams. We get caught in this trap of self-pity on that, and we never break through. We never break free into victory. Essentially what they become, if you've ever been around someone that gets stuck in this cycle, is they kind of become Eeyore. Anybody you know Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh? You ever seen Eeyore before? Yeah. I grew up watching Winnie the Pooh. It was on Disney, but even recently they've had the movie out, Christopher Robin, if you haven't caught that. Eeyore, man, his outlook on life is negative no matter what. I mean, there is nothing good that could possibly happen for Eeyore. But if you're not familiar with Eeyore, watch this real quick with me. You'll get a taste of it.
Good morning, Pooh Bear.
If it is a good morning, which I doubt.
However, did I get your tail back on properly, Eeyore?
No matter. Most likely lose it again anyway.
Poor dear. You know, I may have just the thing. Up, up, up you go. There you are.
It's an awful nice tail, Kanga. Much nicer than the rest of me. It's not much of a tail, but I'm sort of attached to it.
Not much of a house. Just right for not much of a donkey.
Might take a day or two, but I'll find a new one.
End of the road. Nothing to do. And no hope of things getting better. Sounds like Saturday night at my house.
You know any Eeyores in life? Yeah. Why bother? We can't do this thing. Life just happens. It's a trap you can fall into if you fall into this victim mindset, and you got to be careful about it. It can shape you and turn you into a negative person you wished you'd never become. The reality is Joseph could have fallen trap to a victim mindset. He really could have. Every reason in the circumstance, this was a pretty bad story, tying you up, throwing you in a pit. That's a pretty bad day. But Joseph decides he's not going to be a victim, and over again, we'll see that he makes the best of his situation. What we learn from the story is Joseph actually flourishes in Potiphar's household. More and more, Potiphar kind of notices there's something special about this young man, and he seems to be blessed at everything he does. And over time, eventually, Potiphar puts him in charge of his entire household. In many ways, although this was not the trajectory of life that he saw himself going down, he was flourishing where he was at there in Egypt in Potiphar's home. But it's just when things seemed good that he was suddenly going to face his second large challenge in life. We see that challenge come up in Genesis 39, verse 6, where it says this. It says, Joseph was well-built and handsome. See, I totally relate to that. I don't think I like your laughter. Joseph was well-built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Not a good situation at all. What Joseph does, he ends up making the right decision, and we're so grateful for that. But Joseph said no. In fact, and even in one situation where she was really forcing herself on us, he ran away from that situation. However, Potiphar's wife chose to lie, go to her husband, and say that Joseph was coming on to her. Whether that's out of anger, embarrassment, we don't know, but she chose to lie and say that it was actually him that came on to her. Potiphar took Joseph, threw him in jail. Once again, Joseph's life came crumbling down around him. And what we find out is, once again, Joseph's going to have to make a decision. Am I going to be a victim in this thing? Now, I do want to distinguish here two different types of ways in which he was a victim. And the first one, truly, an outside force came, put him in a situation that he had to deal with. He had no control over that. He couldn't do anything about it. Notice how different this time is. And this time, he had to make a decision. In this go-round, he had to make a decision to do the right thing. And what you got to realize is there will be times in life when you will face other people, you will face hurt, you will face trial, because you have to make the right decision. You have to do the right thing. Making the right decision and doing the right things does not always mean that you're going to be able to go down the easy road in life. It will sometimes take you down roads where you will be the victim in the situation. You will be punished for doing the right thing. Just because you do the right thing doesn't mean that life again is going to be rainbows and unicorns. And in this case, Joseph chose to do the right thing, to live on the values he had been taught as a young man, to do what was right in the sight of the Lord, and it cost him. In this case, and sometimes in your life, you're going to have to make decisions and ultimately ask this question that's so important. In this thing I'm about to do, or this decision I'm about to make, am I pleasing God, or am I trying to please others? Who am I trying to please? Joseph chose to please God, and it still got him in trouble. And again, he could have played the victim card. Again, he could have wallowed in his misery and said, "Woe is me. Life is just happening to me." But he didn't. And as the story continues, the jailers noticed that Joseph was special too. And sure enough, even in jail, Joseph prospers, and they start giving him roles, responsibilities, and however you make your way up in a jail system, he did. And you know, more and more people just notice there's something really unique. There's something incredible about this person. Ultimately, he was able to take a huge step in his life. Some years later, Pharaoh has a dream, and nobody can interpret this dream. He goes to all his advisors, all his people around him. Nobody can interpret this dream. Someone in his court said, "Hey, you know what? There's this guy in prison who's really gifted, and he's been able to answer dreams in the past. Why don't you go ask him?" And that person was Joseph. And so Pharaoh went and asked Joseph, and Joseph said, "I do know the interpretation of this dream." And he told Pharaoh, "This dream says that there will be 7 years of really good abundance and harvest in Egypt. But then that will be followed by 7 years of severe famine, not only in Egypt, but in the worlds around you." And he said, "Pharaoh, God has given you this dream so that you can prepare during those 7 years of abundance for the 7 years of famine." Well, Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph and so appreciative that he was able to interpret this dream when nobody else could, that he put Joseph in charge of preparing for that famine that was coming 7 years later. In fact, elevating his stature to being the second most powerful person in Egypt, only second to Pharaoh himself. Once again, we see Joseph overcoming the obstacles that were before him, and now being the second person in charge. And the reality is this: if the story ended right here, this would be a really good story. Joseph overcame, decided not to be a victim, but Joseph was about to face the biggest obstacle of his life. He was about to face a defining moment where he was going to have to deal with some of those emotions from the past, where he was going to have to work through some of the pain that he had gone through and ask himself, how will I make this next decision? What will I do? But before we get to that, real quickly, I want to cover what I think are 4 characteristics I kind of notice in people that have a victim mentality in life. Things that I kind of notice stand out oftentimes in their life. These are your fill-ins on your worship guide, and I think these are great ones to keep track of and kind of go back and review later in the week. What are some of those character traits I notice in people that have a victim mindset? Well, the first one is this: they typically don't take responsibility for their actions. That's one of the things I've noticed. You see, because I'm a victim and this thing's happening to me, it is somebody else's fault. They like to blame other people. They like to blame the world. They like to blame the culture. They like to blame anyone. It's someone else's fault, but it's not my fault. After all, I'm just a victim. Something I see many times in them. The second thing I see quite often is this: they are constantly angry. You ever been around somebody that's just angry all the time? You kind of have to tiptoe around them, or you're like you're walking on glass around them. And any little thing can set them off. They're just angry all the time. Why are they angry? Because life is happening to them. And because life is happening to them, they feel out of control. There's nothing I can do about it. Why bother trying? We're right back to Eeyore again. And because of that, it makes them mad. I'm just mad at the world. I'm mad at everyone. And what sneaks in are these passive-aggressive attitudes and language. Why bother? Why should I try? I'll just lose anyways. The system is rigged against me. And it's that passive-aggressiveness mixed with that anger that eventually leads to a distrust. You look at them, they just kind of have an overall distrust of people and things around them. Do you know anybody that kind of fits that mold a little bit? The third one is this: they live with a sense of entitlement. That's something that makes its way through our culture a little bit today too. They live with a sense of entitlement. Victims believe the world owes them something. After all, you did this thing to me. And they deserve it. And it stems from a couple different things. Sometimes it just stems the sense of entitlement from a lack of gratitude or thankfulness for what they have. Sometimes it comes out of that. But the harder one, the one that stings a little more, is it often sometimes comes from a sense of narcissism too. Because down deep, what you really think is, I'm a little bit better and a little more deserving than everyone else. And that one hurts a little bit, but it's true. I start thinking in our PC culture today what my dad used to tell me growing up, and it probably wouldn't fit very well today, but he used to tell me this many different times, and I've remembered it throughout my life. And he'd just say, Jason, the world owes you nothing, not even a sandwich. Just to tell me that. Jason, the world owes you nothing, not even a sandwich. If you want something, you got to go work hard and get it. That can hit like a lead brick in today's culture, but I think there's some truth to that if we really think about it. Because the reality is this: when you're able to take a step back, get that big view, lose the entitlement, lose the owing in it, you're going to be able to see your situation from a new perspective that will give you clarity on how to engage it and navigate it. Be careful about falling into entitlement. The last one is this: that a failure to forgive leads to revenge. When we lack mercy, when we lack grace in what we do, and there's two things there: there's forgive and there's revenge, and they feed off of each other. And the equation goes something like this: since the world did me wrong and I didn't deserve it, they must pay. Or this person did me wrong, I didn't deserve it, they must pay. When instead, the Bible says that we are called to forgive people no matter what they did, no matter how badly they hurt us, no matter how horrible the thing was, we are called to forgive unconditionally. Why? Because Jesus Christ forgave us exactly that way. That is the love He showed us precisely that way, His grace, His mercy, and He commanded us. He said, a new commandment I give each other: love one another as I have loved you. This same forgiveness, this same grace, this same mercy that I showed you, and you didn't deserve it, by the way, in case you're feeling a little entitled right now. You didn't deserve it. This same grace, this same mercy that I showed you, you have to show others, because if you don't, it will take you down a road you really don't want to go to, and that is the road of revenge, retaliation, bitterness, cynicism. It will make you a cold-hardened person. And too often I see people trapped in a victim mentality that allow their lack of forgiveness to lead them into a revenge mindset. I'm going to pay you back one way or another. It will change you. This is precisely what Joseph would come against. This is precisely what he would deal with. Because about 9 years after where we left the story off, the famine was in full force. The people of Egypt were hungry. The people of the world around them were hungry and had no food. And they were coming to Egypt to buy food because Joseph had done a good job of storing up food during those 7 years of harvest. And don't you know, on one of those days, about 2 years into the famine, 10 brothers showed up at his door. And guess whose brothers they were? They were his. And what's interesting is he recognized them, but they did not recognize him. So he had the upper hand. He had them right where He wanted them. Now's the time, man. Years of pain, years of hurt. Payback's a-coming, my friend, right? No. Genesis 42, what we read is this. It says, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Notice what it says here. And then he remembered his dreams about them. It's an important line. He remembered the dreams about him. It's easy to read over that and miss it, but it's so important. What dream did he remember? He remembered the dream of the wheat stalks, of him standing up and the other 11 bowing down. Guess what? As they're asking for food, they're bowing down and asking for food. He remembered. And I'll tell you what happened here. I believe this with all my heart. It is at this time the light bulb went off. He had his aha moment. He put the pieces together at this point and realized this thing that I've been walking through my entire life was actually part of God's plan. It was actually part of a much larger plan than I ever could have imagined dreaming. In fact, none of us would have dreamed for that plan because none of us would have wanted to walk through it. But I think at that point he realized God actually had His hand on this thing the entire time. It was part of a greater plan. We see that in Genesis 45 verse 4 where it says this, it says, Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one who sold you into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Notice that last line. God sent me ahead of you. See, he could have looked at him and said, you sent me here. You did this to me. You made this happen. No, he refused to be a victim. God sent me ahead of you. He chose to understand that there was a bigger plan going on here, a bigger thing God was working out in which he had a role. And so I want to ask you the hard, difficult question. This thing you're walking through in life, the pain and hurt maybe you've experienced in life that left a real wound, that thing you're struggling with to forgive, have you ever considered the possibility that God has you walking through that because He has a bigger plan for you in life that may be beyond anything you could ever imagine? No, it's not a promise of sunny days all the time. No, sometimes walking with God is the most dangerous place you can be. But you have to believe God's plan is better than yours. And that sometimes you will walk through these valleys and sometimes you will walk down these roads because God has something else in store. Can you choose to believe that? Joseph chose to believe that. And because he chose to believe that, he refused to be a victim. In fact, we see in Genesis 45:8, he said to them, it was not you who sent me here, but God. See, I'm not a victim. It was God who sent me here. Joseph refused to be a victim, which gets us to our so what moment. If you've ever struggled with a victim mentality, there's a couple quick things I'd love to remind you of. A couple of quick things I'd love for you to work on this week. There could be other things, but here's two that I'd love for you to really focus on this week as you work through it. The first one is this: change your story. What do I mean by that? Change your story. What story are you telling? Make the decision to say, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. God's got this thing. And ask yourself, what story am I living in? Am I living in a story where I am a victim, or am I living in God's story? See, Joseph chose to live in God's story, to believe that God had this thing, that He had a plan, He had a purpose for this thing. Which story are you telling? Which story are you living in? Is it a story where you're the victim, or is it a story where you live in victory, claiming that God has this thing? I may not love where I'm at, may not even enjoying what I'm walking through, but God's got this thing. And the second thing is this: hang on to hope. If you had to ask me one thing that I've seen throughout anybody that has a victim mindset, it's just an overall sense of hopelessness. They just feel hopeless. There's no hope in the world. How about you? You ever feel that way? As Christians, we are not called to live without hope. We are the people of hope. We hold the greatest message mankind has ever heard. A risen Savior. And yet so many live with hopelessness. I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. He has another person that had every reason to fall into a victim mindset. Everywhere he went, he got mocked, he got put on trial, he got thrown into jail, he got stoned at times, all sorts of persecution wherever he went. And yet we see him tell the church in Corinth. In 2 Corinthians, he says this to them, "But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead." He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us again. On Him we have set our hope that He will continue to deliver us. Joseph continued throughout his life, in the good times and the bad, to put his hope on God, to believe that He would deliver him. And that unwavering faith allowed him to navigate life even to the point of being able to forgive his brothers and be a blessing to the world. He chose to believe that God's plan is better than my plan and to live in it, not being a victim. And so the question for you is, how about you? What story do you tell? Let's pray.